the genius who wrote the immortal Ooh La La, and the forgotten man who died in poverty and disease. He was the silent heart of two great rock revolutions. But he was too humble. He was swallowed up by his own glory. His name was Ronald Ronnie Lane. He was the man who created the sound of good times, but his life was a brutal war. He courageously walked away from the pinnacle of fame, searching for the truth. But he could not escape the ultimate enemy, something not human, but his own body. This is not just the story of a rock star. This is the anatomy of the forgotten face. A man betrayed not by the world, but by his own genes. The story of Ronnie Lane is inseparable from the environment that forged him, a world that exists now only in grainy black and white photographs. He was born on April 1st, 1946, a practical joke of a birthday for a man who would lead such an impractical life. He was born in Plaistow, East London. This was not the swinging London of fashion, Carnaby Street, and pop art. This was a different universe entirely. This was a gray world, a world of bomb sites, soot, and ration books, a city just beginning to climb out of the ashes of the Second World War. Post-war austerity wasn't a political slogan. It was the taste of the tea, the chill in the air, the reality of everyday life. It was a world of making do, of keeping your head down, of knowing your place. It was a world that valued practicality above all else. The Lane family lived in the heart of this working-class Cockney universe. His father, Stanley, was a lorry driver. But Stanley was not just a father. He was, in Ronnie's own words, a saint. He was a man of immense quiet strength, a man who worked himself to the bone, driving long-distance routes. But his workday didn't end when he clocked off. He would come home, weary, and immediately begin his second unpaid and lifelong shift, caring for his family. This environment, this house, is the single most important key to understanding the psychology of Ronnie Lane. Because the Lane household was defined by two great opposing forces, a profound, almost saintly love, and a profound, inescapable biological curse. The greatest tragedy in the Lane home was not poverty. It was a word, a diagnosis: multiple sclerosis. Stanley Lane, the saint, was not just a lorry driver. He was a full-time carer. He spent his life, his energy, his entire being devoted to caring for his wife. Elsie, Ronnie's mother, was stricken with the disease. And this was not a distant, abstract illness. This was a daily, visceral reality. Ronnie Lane grew up in a house where he watched day after day the slow, relentless, unstoppable decline of his own mother. He saw the weakness. He saw the struggle. He saw the wheelchair. And then the curse revealed its true, horrific nature. It was not a random bolt of lightning. It was a genetic shadow. It was a poison in the bloodline. Ronnie grew up watching the mother he adored slowly fade away, and in the silence of the night, a terrifying question haunted him. Am I next? The Lane home was a house of love, but it was also a house of gradual, unstoppable decline. It was a house haunted by a living ghost. Imagine what this does to a child. A bright, sensitive young boy. He is watching his own future play out in real time. He is seeing his inheritance. When he was young, doctors, in a misguided, almost cruel attempt to be kind, assured him and his father that the disease was not necessarily, not definitively, hereditary. But Ronnie knew. He was a smart lad. He wasn't stupid. He could see his mother. He could see the struggle. He could see the pattern. He knew what the future could hold. He knew that inside his own body, a time bomb could already be ticking. This is the fault line. This is the psychological wound that defines his entire story. For any other kid in the East End, music was an escape. It was a way out of the factory, a way to get girls, a way to be someone. But for Ronnie Lane, it was something far more desperate. It was a race. It was a full-pelt sprint away from a future that was already written in his genes. He wasn't just running towards the spotlight, he was running for his life, trying to outpace the phantom of the wheelchair that he saw reflected in his own mother's eyes. Every hit song, every tour, every party. It was all just a way of running, of staying one step ahead of the ghost. This terror, this genetic phantom, forged the central conflict of his life. His father, Stanley, the practical man, represented order, and his order was a world of safety, stability, and practicality. Stanley wanted his son to have a practical job, to be a lorry driver like him, to be a plumber, to get a trade. In Stanley's world, a trade was the only armor against the chaos of life, against the poverty and the sickness. His love for Ronnie was expressed in this desperate plea for practicality. But for Ronnie, practicality was a trap. A practical job meant staying in the East End. It meant staying in the house of the disease. It meant, in his mind, surrendering to the ghost. And then, from a small crystal radio set, tuned to the pirate stations and the far-off magical signal of Radio Luxembourg, a different world bled into the gray, the raw, unfiltered chaos of American R&B. The propulsive, joyous chaos of Motown and Stax, the acoustic, rebellious chaos of skiffle. This was a world of color, of emotion, of escape. This was a world his father's orderly worldview couldn't understand. This was his choice, his father's order, which felt like a death sentence, or the music's chaos, which felt like the only chance at life. The grind of the East End, however, began early. This was not a world that waited for you to make up your mind. From the age of 10 in 1956, he was already a working man. He was helping his father, hauling heavy loads, working on delivery routes. It was hard, physical labor. And it was here that the phantom played its first cruel trick. The work was heavy. It caused him chronic back pain. A 10-year-old boy with a bad back to the lanes, to Stanley, to Ronnie himself. This was just part of the practical world. It was working class grit. You don't complain, you just get on with it. But this pain, this ache in his spine, it was not the work. We now know this was one of the first insidious early warning symptoms of the multiple sclerosis. He was so desperate to escape the curse was already physically manifesting in his body. But it was disguised perfectly as the normal order of a hard-working life. He normalized the pain. He learned to live with it, to ignore it, to push through it. This habit of ignoring his own body's warning signals would become the defining fatal pattern of his life on tour. He was, in effect, being trained by his practical childhood to ignore the very genetic phantom that was stalking him. He left school at 16. His practical future was all but sealed. He tried plumbing, he tried driving, but the music, the chaos was too strong. He was a listener, he was a student. He was by nature a quiet observer, the perfect personality for the forgotten face. He and his mate, a local lad named Kenny Jones, would hang around the local pubs. Kenny was a drummer. They decided to form a band, a real one, the Outcasts. And here, Ronnie Lane made the single most important decision of his musical life, the decision that would define his entire career, his entire sound, his entire role in rock history. He started as the lead guitarist. He was the one, like most teenage boys, who wanted to be in the front, playing the flashy solos. But he was a practical lad, and he was a smart musician. He was already listening deeper. He understood song structure. He knew intuitively that the power of the American R&B and Motown records they loved didn't come from the flashy guitar solos. It came from the bottom, the groove, the foundation, the melodic, propulsive heartbeat provided by bass players like James Jamerson. So in an act of profound, almost humble musical maturity, he sold his lead guitar. He bought a bass. He chose to step back. He chose to be the anchor. He chose the role of the quiet backbone, the order that would allow the chaos of the frontman to flourish. It was a role he was born to play. He was Stanley's son, after all. He was the carer, the provider, the saint in the background. Making it all possible, he and Kenny Jones were a tight rhythm section, but they were just kids with a dream, playing in pubs. They were an anchor without a ship. They were the order, waiting for the chaos. And in 1965, that chaos walked into his life. The pivot point of British rock history, the moment that would change everything, didn't happen in a stadium. It happened in a small shop, the J60 Music Bar in Manor Park. Ronnie Lane, now a serious musician, walked in with a pocket full of money, ready to buy a brand new harmony bass, and the young, impossibly cocky 5'5" lad working behind the counter, the shop assistant, was Steve Marriott. Marriott was everything Ronnie Lane was not. He was tiny, but he was a human explosion. He was a former child actor. He was a mod face, a trendsetter, arrogant, brimming with a confidence that bordered on obnoxious. And he was possessed of a voice that was pure, uncut, blue-eyed soul. It was a force of nature. It was a meeting of two poles. The planet had just met its first comet. Marriott was the chaos of the spotlight. Lane was the order of the groove Marriott, impressed by this serious, melodic-minded lad, this proper East End boy who understood the music, invited him back to his house. He put on his prized collection of imported Stax and Motown records, and in that moment, as the raw soul of Otis Redding and the tight grooves of Booker T and the MGs filled the room, a bond was forged. This was it. This was the great escape. They weren't just two kids from the East End anymore. They were a sound. They were a band. They recruited Kenny Jones on drums and a friend, Jimmy Winston, on organ. They needed a name that was as confident as Cockney as they were. They were all quite famously short, and in the mod vernacular of the day, a face was a leader, a somebody, a sharp-dressed, undeniable trendsetter. They called themselves the Small Faces. It was a name full of confidence and swagger. It was a name that would, in a matter of months, be on the lips of every teenager in Britain. And for Ronnie Lane, the quiet man with the genetic phantom at his back, it was the name of the ship that was finally going to take him away from it all. The race had begun. The Small Faces were not just a band, they were a gang. And in 1965, London was a city of gangs, of tribes, of sharply defined, impeccably dressed youth cults. But the one that mattered, the one that defined the moment, was the mods. To be a mod in 1965 was not a hobby. It was a 24-hour-a-day devotion. It was about the sharp Italian suit, the custom-tailored parka, the mirrors on your scooter. It was about amphetamines, all-night dancing, and a fanatical, almost academic devotion to American soul and R&B. It was a working-class movement, an act of defiance. It was a way for the children of the austere world, like Ronnie Lane and Steve Marriott, to say, we may not have money, but we have taste, we have style. And into this hyper-stylized, pill-fueled world, the Small Faces arrived like a detonation. They were the perfect mod band. They were mods. They weren't a rich middle-class band from the suburbs pretending to be working class. They were the genuine, unadulterated East End article, and they had the sound to match. Their first move was to find a manager, and they found the most notorious, the most East End manager in the business, Don Arden. Arden was a shark in a sharp suit, a man who famously hung his rivals out of windows. He was the dark side of the practical world Ronnie's father inhabited. He was a man of violence, intimidation, and brutal, thuggish order, but he was also a man who knew a hit when he saw one. Arden signed them, put them on a weekly wage, and pushed them into the studio. Their first single, What You Gonna Do About It, was a raw R&B stomper, built around a borrowed riff from Solomon Burke. It was energetic, but it was Steve Marriott's voice that cut through the radio like a switchblade. It was the sound of a small man with a colossal soul. The song was an immediate smash, hitting number 14 in the UK charts. Almost overnight, Ronnie Lane's life was turned upside down. The 19-year-old son of a lorry driver, the quiet lad who had chosen the bass, was now a face. He was on top of the pops. He was being chased down the street by screaming girls. He had, in one single move, outrun the ghost. He wasn't the sickly boy from the haunted house. He was a pop star. The chaos of music had won, and it was glorious. This was the first great peak, the golden age of the band. And at the center of it was the creative engine, the partnership between Ronnie Lane and Steve Marriott. This was not a simple partnership, like Lennon and McCartney, who were often in competition. This was a partnership of necessity. It was a perfect symbiotic fusion of the order and the chaos that had defined Ronnie's entire life. Steve Marriott was the chaos. He was pure, unfiltered human energy. He was the voice, the frontman, the explosion. He was a performer of breathtaking, almost frightening power. He lived in the moment, for the moment. Ronnie Lane was the order. He was the anchor. He was the melodic architect. His bass lines were not just keeping the beat in the background. They were separate, fully formed melodies. They were the scaffolding that allowed Marriott's chaos to soar without collapsing. Lane was the one thinking about the chord changes, the song structure, the why. He was the writer together. They were untouchable. In 1966, the hits came with a speed that was almost violent. Sha-la-la-la-lee. And then the big one, All or Nothing. All or Nothing was not just a pop song. This was a masterpiece, a soaring, soulful, epic ballad. It was the perfect synthesis of their partnership. The music, co-written by both, had Lane's sophisticated descending chord structure. The lyrics, telling a story of love and loss, were pure, working-class poetry. And Marriott's vocal, it was a performance of such raw, agonizing power that it still sends shivers down the spine. It was a plea, a sermon, a full-blown emotional exorcism. It shot to number 1 in the UK. Ronnie Lane, the 20-year-old son of a lorry driver, the boy who had grown up watching his mother in a wheelchair, was the co-writer of the biggest song in the country he had escaped. He was a face. He had, in his own mind, defeated the genetic phantom, sickness, practicality, the gray East End. That was a world away. He was now a god. But the world of the gods is a fickle one. And Don Arden, their manager, was a devil. The band was working nonstop, touring, recording TV appearances. They were the biggest mod band in the world, but they were still on a 20 quid a week wage. They were, in essence, indentured servants. They were dressed in the finest suits, but they were broke. This was the first crack. The practical East End lad in Ronnie Lane knew something was wrong. He was the one who, as the anchor, would ask the practical questions. Don, where's the money? This created a tension not just with Arden, but with Marriott. Marriott, the chaos, just wanted to perform. He didn't care about the business. Ronnie, the order, cared deeply. He was, after all, the son of a man who understood the value of a hard day's pay. He was haunted by a different kind of East End ghost, the fear of poverty, the fear of being swindled. The scene, too, was changing. The pills, the sharp suits, the R&B, It was all starting to feel dated. In 1967, two things happened that would change the world. The Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and the Summer of Love exploded out of San Francisco. The order of mod gave way to the chaos of psychedelia. The pills were replaced with LSD, the suits were replaced with flowers, incense, and paisley shirts, and the small faces, always musically ambitious, changed with it. They left Don Arden in a famously bitter and violent split and signed with Andrew Loog Oldham, the eccentric visionary manager of the Rolling Stones. Oldham gave them a new label, Immediate Records, and more importantly, he gave them freedom. He gave them unlimited studio time. For Ronnie Lane, the order, the writer, this was paradise. He and Marriott could finally experiment. And their first experiment was a song that would define the era. In Steve Marriott's garden, there was a legend. A local man used to warn that the Ichiku plant would get you high. It was a silly local joke, but in the new psychedelic world, it was inspiration. Ronnie and Steve sat down and wrote a whimsical, strange, and beautiful song about it. Ichiku Park. The song was a masterpiece of the new era. It was pure pop, but it was weird. It featured a new experimental studio effect called flanging, which made Kenny Jones's drums sound like they were sweeping, swirling, and turning inside out. It was a snapshot of a lazy, drug-infused afternoon. It was another massive hit, hitting number 3 in the UK, and crucially, it broke them in America, hitting number 16. The Small Faces had successfully navigated the shift. They weren't just mod heroes, they were now serious psychedelic artists. This freedom, this creative paradise, culminated in 1968 with their magnum opus, Ogden's Nut, Gone Flake. It was a sprawling, brilliant, and utterly bizarre concept album. The entire second side was a psychedelic fairy tale, narrated by the comedian Stanley Unwin about a boy's quest to find the other half of the moon. It was ambitious, it was pretentious, it was glorious. Ronnie Lane was at the creative center of it all. He co-wrote nearly the entire album. This was his order, and Marriott's chaos in perfect, beautiful harmony. The album was released in a revolutionary circular sleeve designed to look like a tobacco tin. It was a work of art. It was an immediate, staggering triumph. It hit number 1 in the UK and stayed there for 6 weeks. The Small Faces had done it. They had beaten the mod label. They had beaten the pop label. They were, at that moment, on par with the Beatles, the Who, and the Kinks. They were artists. Ronnie Lane, the quiet man, the anchor, the practical one, was the co-creator of a number 1 masterpiece. He had escaped the ghost, he had outrun the phantom. He was at the absolute dizzying pinnacle of his life. And then, in the exact moment of his greatest triumph, it all fell apart. The problem with a masterpiece is, what do you do next? How do you top it? And how do you play a psychedelic fairy tale complete with orchestras and comedic narration live on stage? You couldn't. The band was trapped. They were artists who had created a number 1 album that was physically impossible to perform. And the comet in the band, Steve Marriott, was a performer. He was chaos. He lived for the stage, the sweat, the immediate visceral connection with the crowd. He was not an artist in the studio sense, like Ronnie Marriott was getting restless. He was getting bored. And the chaos that made Steve Marriott a star was the very thing that would destroy the band. His ego, fueled by years of adulation, was now out of control. He was the star, and he made sure everyone, especially Ronnie, knew it. Ronnie Lane, the quiet backbone, the co-writer, the melodic anchor, felt himself being pushed aside. He was being treated once again like a sideman in his own band. The old partnership of equals, the order and chaos in balance, was broken. It was just chaos now. And the chaos had a name: Steve Marriott. Marriott was already secretly looking for a way out. He had a new sound in his head, a louder, heavier, bluesier sound. He was jamming with a young guitarist named Peter Frampton. He was dreaming of a new band, a supergroup. The tension was unbearable, Ronnie. The Order, the saint's son, was a natural peacemaker. He tried to hold it together, but he was fighting a losing battle. He was fighting a comet. The end came with a brutal, humiliating, and very public betrayal. On New Year's Eve 1968, the Small Faces were playing a headline gig at Alexandra Palace. It was a disaster. The band was sloppy, the equipment was failing. Marriott, high, drunk, and full of contempt, was in a foul mood. In the middle of the set, without warning, without telling his bandmates, he screamed into the microphone, "I quit," threw down his guitar, and stormed off the stage. Just like that, the Small Faces, the greatest mod band of them all, were finished. Ronnie Lane, Kenny Jones, and Ian McClagan were left standing on stage in front of thousands of people in a state of shock. It was more than a breakup. It was a public execution. It was a betrayal of the deepest, most profound East End kind. You don't do that to your mates. Ronnie Lane was devastated. He was 22 years old. He had lost his band, his livelihood, and most painfully, his best mate. He fell into a deep, dark depression. He was haunted by the potential lost, the feeling that Ogden's was just the beginning, a beginning that was now, thanks to one man's ego, gone forever. He was once again the forgotten face. The order he had so carefully constructed, the band, the songs, the success, had been instantly annihilated by the chaos he had trusted. And the genetic phantom, the ghost of MS, the ghost of his mother in the wheelchair, that ghost which had been kept at bay by the bright lights and the loud music, was suddenly, in the new, terrifying silence, back. And it was whispering, "You see, you can't escape. It all falls apart. You can't run forever." He was, for the first time since he was 16, back at square one, a practical man with no practical job, a musician with no band, and a man with a terrifying ticking clock inside his own body. The race wasn't over. It had only just begun. The silence of 1969 was deafening. He, Kenny Jones, and Ian McClagan were the Small Faces, left behind. They were adrift. They bought a boat, a houseboat on the Thames, and they floated. They drank. They tried to write songs, but the magic was gone. The heart had been ripped out. They were an anchor, a rhythm section without a ship. They were the order, with no chaos to give them purpose. They knew they needed a new comet. They needed a new voice. But how do you replace a voice like Steve Marriott's? You don't. You can't. The very idea felt like a betrayal. The answer, the resurrection, didn't come from an audition. It came, as it so often does in rock and roll, from a pub. It came from a mate. The man who would be the bridge was a guitarist named Ronnie Wood. Woody. He was one of them, a mod, a face, a man who loved the same R&B records, a man who, like them, was in a band that was also, at that very moment, disintegrating. Ronnie Wood was the bassist for the Jeff Beck group, but he was a guitarist at heart, and he was trapped, just as they were, by the whims of a volatile, brilliant, and deeply unpredictable comet named Jeff Beck. And the singer in that collapsing band was a young, spiky-haired kid with a voice like sandpaper and honey, a lad named Rod Stewart. The Jeff Beck group, like the Small Faces, was a masterpiece of dysfunction. They were supposed to play Woodstock, but in a fit of pique, Jeff Beck had broken that band up just days before the festival. So in late 1969, you had two sets of refugees, two bands shattered by their own comets. On one side, Lane, Jones, and McClagan, the tightest rhythm section in Britain, the Order, looking for a voice. On the other, Wood and Stewart, the chaos, a world-class guitarist and a superstar in waiting, looking for a home. The merger was not a calculated corporate decision. It was an accident. It was a boozy jam session. Ronnie Wood, the bridge, started hanging out with Ronnie Lane. They were mates. Wood started playing guitar with them just for fun. The fit was immediate. Then he brought his other mate along. Rod Stewart was at first hesitant. The Small Faces? They were a mod band. They were tiny. He was a blues guy. But he came along anyway. And in a smoky, boozy rehearsal room, something happened. It wasn't the tight, artistic, psychedelic order of Ogden's Nut Gone Flake. It was something else entirely. It was sloppy. It was loud. It was joyous. It was the sound of 5 musicians who were all finally free. It was the sound of a good time. It was the sound of a pub sing-along played with the skill of masters. It was, in a word, real. This was Ronnie Lane's resurrection. This was his dream. He wasn't just joining a new band. He was creating the perfect band. A band of equals, a band of mates, a democracy. There would be no comet this time, no single front man to hijack the dream. They would all share the vocals. They would all write. They would all share the spotlight. They needed a name. They were all faces, they decided. That much was true, but they weren't exactly small anymore. Stewart and Wood were famously lankily tall. So, in a symbolic act of moving on, they dropped the small. They became simply faces. The band that emerged in 1970 was the living, breathing, drinking embodiment of a good time. They were the antidote to the serious, pretentious artist world that had dominated the end of the 60s. They were not lost intellectuals like Alan Wilson or psychedelic fairy tale writers like their former selves. Faces were about one thing and one thing only: boogie. They were the sound of a party that is just about to fall apart, but in the best possible way. Their music was a joyous, shambolic, soulful fusion of rock and roll, blues, and folk, all held together by Ronnie Lane's rambling, melodic bass. His bass playing, once the tight, driving anchor of the mod-era Small Faces, now changed. It became looser, more lyrical, more country. He wasn't just the anchor, he was the narrator. His bass lines were little stories, weaving in and around the guitars, a Cockney country style that was entirely his own. He was the order, but he had learned to dance with the chaos. Their first album, First Step, was a bit of a mess. It sounded quite literally like 2 different bands colliding. But by Long Player, the sound was gelling, and it was on this album that Ronnie Lane established his new role. He was the soul. While Rod Stewart was the raspy, boozy chaos of the rock songs, Ronnie Lane was the order of the folk songs. He was the quiet, poignant, acoustic heart of the band. His songs, like Richmond, were gentle, introspective ballads, full of the pastoral gypsy soul he had always possessed. He was the songwriter who gave the band its depth, its texture, and my God, the live shows. A Faces concert was not a concert. It was a party. It was a traveling circus. They would come on stage, sloppy, drunk, laughing. They'd kick footballs into the crowd. They'd share bottles of brandy. They were a gang, and the audience was invited to be a part of it. It was the absolute perfect realization of Ronnie's democratic dream. He would step up to the mic and sing his songs. Rod would sing his, and Woody would sing his. They were 5 faces on one stage. A band of brothers in 1971, they released A Nod is as Good as a Wink to a Blind Horse. This was the one. This was the peak. It was the perfect distillation of their sound. It was loud, it was funny, and it was deeply soulful. And it had the anthem, Stay With Me. Stay With Me was a global stadium-rocking smash. It was the sound of the band at its most chaotic and glorious. It was a sleazy, unrepentant, magnificent rock song. and it made them global superstars. Ronnie Lane, the 26-year-old forgotten face of the Small Faces, was back. He was in arguably the biggest and certainly the coolest band in the world. He was rich. He was a critical darling. He was a face in a band of faces. He had escaped the East End. He had escaped the ghost of Marriott. He had finally won the race against the genetic phantom. And then history repeated itself. The tragedy of Ronnie Lane is that he was a planet, fated to be orbited by comets, and the comet he had invited into his new democratic home was named Rod Stewart. The problem was this: Rod Stewart was not just a face. He was at the same time a solo artist, signed to a separate deal with Mercury Records. And in 1971, the same year Faces were finding their groove with Longplayer, Rod Stewart's solo career didn't just take off, it exploded. He released a solo album called Every Picture Tells a Story. And on that album was a song, a little folk-based mandolin tune about an older lover, a song called Maggie May. Maggie May was not a hit. It was a phenomenon. It went to #1 in the UK, #1 in the US. It was the biggest song on the planet. Overnight, Rod Stewart didn't just become a star, he became the biggest star on the planet. And Ronnie Lane, the anchor, the quiet backbone, felt a cold, familiar dread. It was Steve Marriott all over again. His democratic band of mates, his perfect order, was, almost instantly, hijacked by a new comet, a new chaos he could not control. Suddenly the press wasn't interested in Faces. They were interested in Rod Stewart. The band that Ronnie Lane had co-founded was, in the public's eye, becoming simply Rod Stewart and the Faces. It was a demotion. It was an erasure. Rod, for his part, was torn. He was loyal to his mates, to a point. He was, as he famously said, a face in the group and a star on my own. But the star was now making millions, and the group was splitting the profits 5 ways. The chaos of superstardom began to infect the order of the band. Ronnie Lane, the forgotten face, felt himself being erased. Again, he was still the soul. He was still writing the band's most heartfelt, most critically acclaimed songs. On A Nod is as Good as a Wink, his song Debris was a devastatingly beautiful personal song. It was a lament for his father, Stanley, watching the East End he knew get torn down by developers. I left you on the debris, he sang, his voice full of a gentle working-class melancholy. It was a masterpiece. But the world wasn't buying a Faces album to hear Ronnie Lane sing a sad song about his dad. They were buying it to hear Rod Stewart sing about shagging and drinking. The band's dynamic, once a joyous, boozy, all-for-one order, was fracturing. It became, in effect, 2 bands, Rod's solo band and Faces the practical East End lad in Ronnie Lane. The man who had been swindled by Don Arden was also horrified by the new chaos of superstardom, the private jets, the limousines, the groupies, the sheer staggering waste. He was still, at heart, Stanley's son. He was a man who liked a pub, a pint, and a song. He was not a rock god. He was a musician. And he felt his practical fear of poverty returning. The band was making millions, but they were spending millions. It felt to him like another house of cards, another machine, just like the mod machine that was going to collapse and leave him, the anchor at the bottom. The tension, the resentment was building. He was the forgotten face in the photos. He was the quiet one in the interviews. He was, once again, being pushed aside by a charismatic, all-consuming comet. And in 1973, that resentment culminated in the final, perfect, cinematic betrayal. The band was in the studio, recording what would be their final album, The Atmosphere Was Toxic. Rod Stewart, now a global superstar, was barely there. He was flying in, laying down a vocal, and flying out. He was, by all accounts, disinterested. He was saving his best songs, his A material, for his own far more lucrative solo albums. The Faces, they were getting his leftovers. Ronnie Lane, the Order, the Anchor, was trying desperately to hold it all together. And he had a song. He had the song. It was his masterpiece, a gentle, acoustic, world-weary ballad. It was written from the perspective of a grandfather, a wise old man, looking back at his life and talking to his grandson. It was a song about wisdom, regret, and the painful lessons of youth. It was called Ooh La La. It was, in its 3.5-minute folksy structure, the entire story of Ronnie's own life. It was a song by a practical man, a working-class philosopher. It was the order of his father's wisdom, mixed with the chaos of his own rock and roll life. And it was the title track of the new album. This was his moment. This was his song. He laid down the demo with his own gentle, honest vocal and played it for the band. And this is where the betrayal, the one that would break his heart, happened. Rod Stewart, the superstar, the singer of the band, heard it, and he didn't get it. He allegedly complained. He said it wasn't in his key. He said the old man perspective wasn't for him. He was Rod Stewart. He was the sexy one. He sang about Stay With Me and Maggie May. He did not sing wise, gentle songs about grandfathers. He recorded a version, a half-hearted, almost insulting attempt. And he hated it. He dismissed it. He, in essence, refused to sing it. Can you imagine? Can you comprehend the sheer, staggering, egotistical gall? The singer of the band, the biggest frontman on the planet, refused to sing the title track of his own band's album, a song written by the band's co-founder, the man standing right next to him. It was a public, professional, and deeply personal humiliation. It was Steve Marriott storming off stage, but this time it was slower, colder, and more calculated. It was the comet telling the planet, you do not matter. The band was in a bind. They had a title track, a masterpiece, and no lead vocal. Finally, in an act of friendship, Ronnie Wood stepped up. Woody, the guitarist, the mate, said, "I'll give it a go, Plonk." Woody went into the booth, and with his own rough, gentle, untrained voice, he sang it, and it was perfect. He captured the song's soul precisely because he wasn't a superstar. He sounded real. The song was saved, but Ronnie Lane was broken. That was the end. It wasn't just about one song. It was the pattern. It was the symbol of everything. It was Marriott. It was Rod. It was the comets devouring the planet. It was the chaos destroying his order. He was invisible. He was the forgotten face in his own home. The album Ooh La La was released in 1973. And in a final bitter twist of irony, it went straight to #1 in the UK Faces, were at that exact moment the biggest band in Britain. They were at the absolute peak of their fame. And on June 4th, 1973, Ronnie Lane quit. He walked away from a #1 album. He walked away from the private jets. He walked away from the stadium tours. He walked away from the money. He chose his soul over the spotlight. He chose order. The year was 1973. Ronnie Lane was 27 years old. He was, for the first time in nearly a decade, completely, terrifyingly, and wonderfully free. This was not a collapse. This was a liberation. He had not been fired. He had resigned. He had, in a final defiant act of order, taken back control. He had defeated the chaos of the comets, Marriott and Stewart, by simply walking off the playing field. He was no longer the forgotten face. He was once again just Ronnie, but Ronnie was a more complex figure than the world knew. He was not just the quiet one. He was Stanley's son. And Stanley's son was, at his core, a practical man, a working-class East End lad who, in the shadow of his sainted lorry driver father, believed in a hard day's work, in mates, and in paying your own way. He was also a man haunted by two genetic phantoms, the fear of poverty and the fear of multiple sclerosis. Though he was free, he was also, once again, broke. The financial chaos of the band had left him with very little, and the genetic phantom, the ghost he had been running from, the ghost he had been ignoring, that numbness in his legs he had been blaming for years on tour fatigue and drinking, it was getting worse. He had escaped the prison of fame. He had escaped the shadow of the comets. But he was, at that very moment, walking straight into a much, much darker prison, one he could never, ever escape. Now free from the faces, he set out to build a new world, a world that would be the antidote to the one he'd just left. If Faces was a chaos of egos, jets, and superstars, his new life would be an order of democracy, mates, and the land. He took his money, what little he had managed to save from the financial wreckage of two superstar bands, and he didn't buy a mansion in Beverly Hills, he didn't buy a flashy sports car, he bought a farm. He called it Fishpool Farm, a sprawling, run-down patch of land on the border of Wales. And here, he began to build his utopian dream. He didn't just form a band, he formed a commune. He bought sheep, chickens, and a fleet of second-hand caravans. He, his family, and his new band of musicians would all live there together. It was a rejection of the entire rock star machine. It was a practical man's return to the practical earth, and the band he formed was the perfect reflection of this new order. He called it Slim Chance. The name itself was a joke, a classic self-deprecating Cockney joke. What was the slim chance that he'd make it without Rod Stewart, that this absurd gypsy commune would actually work? It was a wink to the practical world that had always told him he was mad. And the sound was the most revolutionary thing he ever did. It was the total opposite of the electric boogie rock chaos of the Faces. This was the music of his heart, the music of his roots. It was a rambling, acoustic, joyous orchestra of fiddles, mandolins, accordions, and acoustic guitars. It was gypsy rock. It was folk. It was the sound of an Irish pub, a working-class sing-along, and a country fair all rolled into one. It was the practical music of the people. This was Ronnie Lane, the anchor, finally cutting the rope and letting his own ship sail. He was the front man. He was the writer. He was the boss. And for a brief, beautiful, shining moment, it worked. The British public, charmed by his authenticity, by this forgotten face, finally stepping into his own gentle spotlight, fell in love with him. In 1974, his first single with Slim Chance, a jaunty, infectious pub stomp called How Come, was a massive, unexpected hit. It shot to number 11 on the UK charts. He followed it up with The Poacher, another gorgeous, melodic, folk-infused track. It, too, was a hit, climbing to number 36. This was his validation. This was the proof. He was right. He didn't need Rod. He didn't need Marriott. He didn't need the Comets. His own quiet order was enough. He, Ronnie Lane, the son of a lorry driver, the quiet man, the forgotten face, was a star in his own right. He was, for the first time, in complete control. And this, tragically, is where the practical man's dream began to collide with the practical man's paranoia. Ronnie Lane was haunted by his East End ghosts. The first ghost was poverty. The second and more dangerous was the practical man's deep-seated distrust of other practical men, specifically managers. He had been, in his view, swindled twice, first by the thuggish order of Don Arden, who had kept the Small Faces on a 20 quid a week wage while they were the biggest band in Britain, second by the corporate chaos of the Faces, where millions of dollars seemed to vanish into the pockets of accountants, publicists, and private jet companies. He was never going to let that happen again. He was Stanley's son. He would be his own boss. He would manage himself. He would control the order. And this obsession with control, born from a practical fear, would lead to his practical ruin. He had a new, magnificent, and utterly insane idea. It was his utopian dream, taken to its logical, beautiful, and catastrophic conclusion. He called it the passing show. In 1976, he decided to take his commune, his gypsy rock circus, on the road, and I mean a literal circus. This would not be a tour. This would be a medieval, rambling, traveling fair. He bought a massive circus big top. He hired acrobats, fire eaters, clowns, and a one-legged juggler. He would, in his words, bring the circus back to the people, just like in the old days. The passing show would travel from town to town, set up in a local field, and the townspeople would come out for a day of music, magic, and community. It was a beautiful, pure, artistic dream. It was his order, his practical East End community spirit, made manifest. It was also, from a practical business standpoint, one of the most spectacularly idiotic ideas in the history of rock and roll. He, Ronnie Lane, the practical man, was now the ringmaster, the promoter, the accountant, and the star, all at once. He was paying for the tents, the lorries, the wages for the clowns, the feed for the animals. He was betting everything on his own personal, practical vision. And it was a complete, unmitigated, heartbreaking disaster. The logistics were a nightmare. The British weather, in its infinite cruelty, was relentless. It rained and rained. The fields turned to mud. The lorries got stuck. The audiences, sparse to begin with, shivered in the cold, wet tents. The practical man had forgotten the practical reality of the British summer. He was, in a very real, very tragic sense, bankrupted by his own dream. He was destroyed by his own order. The very practical fear of being swindled by managers had led him to swindle himself on a scale Don Arden could only have dreamed of. The passing show collapsed, leaving him in a ruinous, staggering debt. The forgotten face was now a bankrupt face. The ghost of poverty, the one he thought he'd escaped, was no longer a phantom. It was a reality. And all this time, all through the passing show, all through the glorious rise of Slim Chance, the other ghost, the genetic phantom, was no longer whispering, it was knocking. The human mind is a master of denial, and Ronnie Lane's mind, the practical mind of an East End lad, was one of the strongest. The fatigue he'd felt, that was just tour fatigue. It was the chaos of the rock and roll life. The back pain he'd had since he was 10, that was just hard work. That was the order of a practical life. The numbness in his legs, the sudden, terrifying moments of tripping on a flat stage, that was pinched nerves. It was the booze. It was anything but the one thing he knew in his deepest, most terrified heart that it could be. During the Slim Chance era, the symptoms worsened. His practical mind, the one that could organize a circus, was now at war with his practical body. His fingers, the fingers that had written those beautiful melodic bass lines, were becoming clumsy. He was fumbling notes. He was struggling to hold a plectrum. He was terrified, but he was also Stanley's son. You don't complain. You don't show weakness. You just get on with it. He was now, in 1976, financially and physically collapsing at the same time. He was desperate, and in his desperation, he agreed to the one thing he swore he would never do. He agreed to a Small Faces reunion. He didn't do it for the art. He did it for the money. He was bankrupt. He needed the cash. But the moment he stepped into that rehearsal room, the dream died. The chaos of Steve Marriott's ego was still there, unchanged, untamed. Marriott was loud, obnoxious, and wanted to re-record their old hits in a new, loud 70s rock style, completely missing the order and charm that had made them special. But for Ronnie, there was a new and far more private horror. He couldn't play. It wasn't just that he was rusty. His fingers would not cooperate. The speed, the dexterity, it was gone. He was trying to play the old hits, his own songs, and his body was betraying him. It was a private, cold, humiliating terror. He lasted 2 rehearsals, and he quit. He had to. He couldn't let them see. He couldn't let his oldest mates see that he was failing. He was now a man at the absolute bottom, bankrupt, his utopian dream of the passing show in tatters, and now a musician who could no longer trust his own hands. The genetic phantom was laughing. He was alone. He was broke, and he was sick. And then a hand reached out, the hand of another orderly man, another brilliant, practical, East End adjacent musician who understood the chaos of the rock world, Pete Townshend. Townshend, the leader of The Who, was a great admirer and a true friend. He saw Ronnie suffering financially and artistically, and he offered him a lifeline. Not a handout, but a collaboration. An act of peer-to-peer respect. "Let's make an album together," he said, "just us." The result, released in 1977, was the album Rough Mix. It is perhaps the most beautiful, gentle, and heartbreaking album in either of their careers. It is not a rock album. It is a masterpiece of folk, of acoustic honesty. It is the sound of 2 old friends, 2 weary survivors of the 1960s, sitting down, looking back, and finding some order in the wreckage. The album features songs by both men and contributions from their mates, including Eric Clapton. It is, by any measure, a work of genius. It was critically adored. It was hailed by critics as one of the best, most practical, most authentic albums of the year. And of course, it was a complete commercial dud. It was 1977. The chaos of punk rock was exploding in London. The chaos of disco was taking over America. The world was not in any way ready for a quiet, gentle, acoustic folk album by 2 old rock stars. For Ronnie, it was the final bitter irony, his greatest, most authentic artistic statement. And nobody wanted it. But something far more significant, far more life-altering happened during the recording of Rough Mix. Ronnie's symptoms were now impossible to hide. He was stumbling in the studio. His speech was sometimes slurred. His fingers were failing him. His new girlfriend, Boo Oldfield, was terrified. Pete Townshend, the practical man, was deeply, deeply concerned. This was not booze. This was not fatigue. This was something else. He finally went to a doctor, then another. They ran tests, and then he was called back in. The year was 1977. Ronnie Lane, the 31-year-old musical genius, was sitting in a cold, sterile, orderly doctor's office, and he was handed his life sentence: multiple sclerosis. This was not a diagnosis. This was a confirmation. It was the genetic phantom that haunted his childhood home, the ghost he saw in his mother's eyes, finally stepping out of the dark and placing its hand on his shoulder. The practical joke of his April 1st birthday had revealed its final cruel punchline. The race was over. The ghost he had been running from since he was a small boy had caught him. His worst, most private, most defining fear was now his official, inescapable reality. He was 31 years old. His practical father, Stanley, was still alive, still caring for his mother. Ronnie, the pop star, the face, was now officially one of his patients. The timing was a work of almost Shakespearean cruelty. He was financially ruined. the passing show, his utopian dream, had collapsed into a mountain of debt. His artistic career was at a standstill, ignored by the chaos of the punk market. And now, the chaos of his biology had declared a total, non-negotiable war on the order of his body. He was a man with no band, no money, no commercial value, and now no future. This is the bottom. The absolute, terrifying, cold, hard bottom. He is no longer the forgotten face of rock and roll. He is just a forgotten man. The practical world had finally and permanently won. What do you do? What does the practical son of Stanley Lane do, now that he is in a horrifying echo becoming his own family's tragedy? He is no longer the saint's son. He is now the patient, the burden. He was, by all accounts, terrified. He was also, by all accounts, furious. But Ronnie Lane was not a man built for self-pity. He was an East End lad. He was a face. And he was, above all, the anchor. He may have been bankrupted by his own orderly dream, but he would be damned if he was going to be defined by his body's chaos. His practical mind, the one that could organize a circus, now focused on a new, more desperate practical task, survival. But survival costs money, and he had none. The royalties from the small faces, the all-or-nothing and Itchy Coo Park millions he was owed, they were still tied up in a legal, contractual chaos orchestrated by Don Arden years earlier. He was literally a musical legend who could not afford his own medical care. His friends, his mates, saw this. Eric Clapton, his friend from the Rough Mix sessions, began quietly, anonymously, paying his bills. But Ronnie, the practical, proud man, couldn't live on charity. He was sinking. And in 1983, with his symptoms worsening, his body becoming a prison, his finances non-existent, his mates decided they had had enough. This is the pivot. This is the moment the Ronnie Lane story ceases to be a tragedy and becomes a testament his girlfriend, Boo Oldfield, and the legendary producer Glyn Johns saw their friend, this gentle, brilliant anchor, being destroyed, not just by a disease, but by the practical horror of poverty. They decided to act, and they did it in the only way the rock and roll world knows how. They decided to throw a party, a practical party, a benefit. They made the calls, and the comets, the superstars who had orbited Ronnie his entire life, the very men who had overshadowed him, now, in his darkest hour, they returned. But they didn't return as comets. They returned as planets. They returned to orbit him. The event was called the ARMS Concert, for Action for Research into Multiple Sclerosis. It was held at the Royal Albert Hall in London in September 1983. Look at the lineup. It is staggering. It is perhaps the single greatest collection of guitar gods ever assembled on one stage. Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, Jimmy Page, the three guitar gods of Britain, the Holy Trinity, who had never played together before. They were all there for one reason. They were not there for money. They were not there for fame. They were there for plonk, their affectionate Cockney rhyming slang nickname for their mate, Ronnie Lane. They were joined by Steve Winwood, Bill Wyman, his old mate Kenny Jones. It was a staggering, unprecedented show of love. The practical East End lad's greatest fear, poverty, was being annihilated by his greatest practical strength, mateship. The forgotten face was, for this one night, the only face. He was the center of the rock and roll universe. And at the end of the night, after the gods had played their solos, a roadie helped a small, frail man to the center of the stage. He was thin, he was unsteady, but he was smiling. It was Ronnie. And in a voice that was weaker, thinner, but still possessed that gentle, honest, Cockney gypsy soul, he sang. He sang his own anthem, How Come? He sang Ooh La La. The entire Royal Albert Hall, filled with superstars, producers, and fans, was weeping. It was a moment of profound, almost unbearable emotional order. The chaos of his disease and his finances was for one night held at bay by the sheer practical power of love and respect. The Arms concert was more than just a gig. It was a revolution. This was 1983. This was before Band-Aid. This was before Live Aid. This was before the rock and roll superstar charity event became a thing. Ronnie Lane, the quiet backbone, the forgotten face, the man who had been bankrupted by his own utopian passing show, had, in his moment of greatest weakness, accidentally invented the modern rock and roll charity super concert. He had once again turned chaos into order. He had taken his own private genetic phantom and turned it into a global practical force for good, raising millions for research, giving his own suffering a profound public purpose. The saint's son had in the end become a saint himself. The Arms concert, which toured America, gave him financial security, but it could not give him back his health. The genetic phantom was relentless. The British damp and cold he felt was making it worse. So in 1984, Ronnie Lane, the ultimate East End lad, did what so many rock stars do. He fled to America. But he wasn't looking for fame. He wasn't chasing the chaos of Hollywood. He was, as always, the practical man. He was seeking a practical solution. He moved to Houston and then to Austin, Texas, hoping, praying that the warm, dry climate would ease his symptoms, would slow the chaos in his body. He was now, in effect, on a permanent passing show, a gypsy in exile. But here is the most important part. He never stopped being a musician. This is the ultimate triumph of his orderly spirit. The genetic phantom could take his mobility, but it could not take his soul. He formed an American version of Slim Chance. He was by now confined to a wheelchair, but this did not stop him. The image is one of the most heartbreaking and inspiring in all of rock history. Ronnie Lane, frail, thin, his body a prison, being wheeled on stage in the small, hot, smoky clubs of Austin, Texas, and he would sing. His voice was weaker, ravaged by the disease, but he would sing, and the practical man, the anchor, was still, even in a wheelchair, the leader. He was still the governor, calling out chord changes, directing the band, his spirit burning with a light that his body simply could not extinguish. This was his all or nothing. This was his final defiant stand. But the practical ghosts of the East End were never far behind. The royalties, the money he was owed from his life's work, they still weren't coming. The legal chaos of the Don Arden era was a tangled mess. And a disease like MS in America is a financially ruinous chaos. The practical man, the man who had raised millions for other MS sufferers, was now struggling to pay his own medical bills. And so the Comets returned. But this time they returned quietly. Rod Stewart, the man who had refused to sing his song, the man whose chaos had broken his heart, now quietly began paying the bills. Ronnie Wood, his mate, did the same. Jimmy Page, his Arms collaborator, did the same. The anchor, who had been overshadowed by the Comets, was now, in his final fading years, being held in orbit by them. It was a quiet, private, and profound act of atonement. The forgotten face was, by the ones who had forgotten him, being remembered in 1994, he made his last practical move. He moved to the high, dry mountain air of Trinidad, Colorado. It was a last desperate, practical attempt to find a place where his body could be at peace. He was a long, long, long way from Plaistow. He was 51 years old. His body was ravaged, but his spirit, his Cockney grit, his orderly mind was unbroken. On June 4th, 1997, exactly 24 years to the day that he had walked away from the Faces, Ronnie Lane died. The official cause was pneumonia, a common and fatal complication for MS patients. His body, the practical machine, had finally, after a 20-year war, surrendered. He was buried in a small, quiet cemetery in Trinidad, Colorado. The Face, who had defined London mod rock, the Face who had defined 70s boogie, the man who had co-written Itchy-Coo Park and All or Nothing, died a quiet, almost anonymous death, thousands of miles from home. It was the final tragic exile of the forgotten Face. How, then, do we make sense of a life so defined by its tragic contradictions? What does this autopsy finally reveal? His life was a cruel paradox. He was the anchor in a world that only valued the comets. He was the order in a world that only celebrated the chaos. He was the practical man, destroyed by the most impractical of businesses. And he was the man defined and ultimately killed by his inheritance. The genetic phantom of MS, which he had seen in his mother, had shaped his entire life. It was the terror he ran from, the chaos that fueled his escape into music. And it was the order of his body's betrayal that finally ended his race. But that is not the whole story. His musical legacy is finally being heard. He was one of the first and greatest melodic bass players in rock. He didn't just play the root note, he played the song. He was the practical glue, the orderly heart that made the chaos of Marriott and Stewart possible. His gypsy rock sound with Slim Chance was years ahead of its time, a clear, direct line to the unplugged and Americana movements that would follow. And the songs, Debris, All or Nothing, Itchy-Coo Park, and of course, Ooh La La. This is the final perfect, beautiful irony. The song that symbolized his betrayal, the song his superstar singer refused to sing, the forgotten song by the forgotten Face. That is the song that has outlasted all the loud, boozy, stay-with-me rock anthems. It is that song that plays in movies. It is that song that a new generation connects with. It is that song that, in its gentle, wise, practical humility, perfectly encapsulates his entire life. I wish that I knew what I know now when I was younger. It is his own epitaph. In 2012, 15 years after his death, Ronnie Lane was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, recognized for his legendary work in both The Small Faces and Faces the Forgotten Face, was at last formally and practically remembered. He was a man who lost the race against his own body, but he won the war for his soul. He was the saint's son who became a practical hero. He turned his personal chaos into a global order that has saved lives. Ronnie Lane's life was a testament to the East End value of endurance. He was the anchor. He was the heart. And in the end, the anchor is the one thing that remains long after the comets have burned out and the chaos has faded to silence.